The Pope's visit to Canada was a step forward in achieving Indigenous reconciliation, as it was seen by many, but many people are still calling for more to be done. Joining me now to discuss the Government of Canada's perspective on the issue of moving forward with Indigenous reconciliation after the papal visit to Canada is Crown-Indigenous Relations Minister Marc Miller, who joins me from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. Minister, thanks so much for making the time. Let's just start out with that piece. Obviously, the Pope made his visit to Canada, again, something that many people had been calling on him to do for quite a while. A lot of people said it was really what needed to be done in order to achieve Indigenous reconciliation. But what is the Government of Canada doing to continuously improve that, I guess, relationship and to move forward with Indigenous reconciliation?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Wyatt. This is it's a real pleasure to be with you. I think it's an important question for all of Canada, but I think foremost for those who attended residential schools and have been, fighting for decades to hear an apology from the head of an institution that was responsible for the spiritual religious aspect and teaching that was completely intertwined with it, of about 60% of the 60+% of the residential schools that were in operation, and that hadn't been coming. Canada, for its part, apologized a number of years ago, and a number of churches followed suit. In fact, prior to that, the Anglican Church had apologized, as well as the United Church. So the big missing apology and reckoning, and really recognition of harm done, and an apology for some of the awful, really horrific things that happened in residential schools was missing, and it had to be done in the right way, including in the way that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for it in one of its calls to action. I think the focus, in my mind, and I think rightly so, needs to be on those survivors and how they are processing an apology. Sometimes apologies do take time to process and internalize, and then see if it actually helps with some closure. There's a lot of people that aren't speaking up about this because they still have that trauma inside of them, and it's a very understandable human emotion to keep things pent up, and some will take that sadly to the grave, but a lot are also speaking up, and with a lot of courage, even for the first time. So knowing that this is a matter that involves human beings and their unique experiences, even though it was part of a system in residential schools, is something that we have to respect as a country. The Pope's apology, I attended the initial apology in Maskwacis, just outside Edmonton, and was with representing Canada in Iqaluit, and able to witness firsthand some of the direct contact that those survivors could have with the Pope and speak their truth in really raw fashion. There's a lot of abuse, physical and unspeakable sexual abuse, that they spoke directly to the Pope about. I'm a pretty good judge of human character, and you could, most of the time, I guess, but you could see that the Pope was quite shaken by some of that. And I think it influenced his thinking, and rightly so, because I don't think anyone could go unchanged from those meetings. You asked where we go from here. I think part of any recognition that involves any seriousness to it is, one, the full and formal apology, but also where you go from there. And so what I've had the honor of doing after visiting close to 20 former residential schools over the last year since Kamloops is talk to survivors and see and hear them speak about their experiences, sure, and they're very, very deep and profound and poignant, but about the path forward. And there's a lot of hope from those survivors, just as there was when they heard the Pope's apology, is whatever view you want to have on it in the future. And that includes education, transforming our country to make sure that we are teaching about residential schools, not only Indigenous peoples who know it from their parents or grandparents having attended, but also across Canada. And I know my kids are learning about it, transforming the way education is done so that you're not reproducing the residential school model. That's schools on reserve, taught in their own language and culture with education transformation, and also dealing with not only short-term matters, but long-term issues in and around mental health, and making sure that proper resources are in communities to help people deal with and get some closure. We could speak at length about investments that the federal government has put into communities. It maybe isn't the time. I'm glad to get into that, but there has been a lot of work done over the last few years by this government to move forward on what we call reconciliation, which is many moving parts, and sometimes we make mistakes and need to recognize that and make them right. But on a path that is forward and involving communities. The one lesson I think as a government official or even as a cabinet minister that you come to realize quite quickly is I can't do it alone and shouldn't be doing it alone. It needs to be with the vast number of Indigenous voices that have the right solution and can tell us where to go as a country.
And when you look at, again, the Pope's visit to Canada, a lot of people believe it was a step forward in terms of achieving an Indigenous reconciliation, but a lot of people also, you mentioned mental health. A lot of people are, kind of struggling with the idea of, someone like Pope Francis who came to Canada. A lot of people, still that isn't really enough in many cases for some people to heal in the way that they feel they need to from, again, the residential school system. So what will you do as a government to offer in, this case, mental health supports to, again, people who still say that this isn't enough and who are still not able to heal after the Pope's visit to Canada?
Yeah, to your point, you're absolutely right. On the spectrum of reactions, which can obviously change, at the event, there was, a lot of tears and a sense, if I can generalize, and it's difficult to generalize, but a real sense that this apology was meaningful. And for a lot of Indigenous people that went to residential schools, this was something that means a lot to them. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people that couldn't care less, and for a variety of reasons that can be unpacked as well. And there's a range of emotions and feelings and views. In between that, there was a fear I heard notably that this visit would be an opportunity for the Catholic Church to reconvert people that had their traditions and language and culture ripped away from them. And so some trepidation and worry that that would be one of the net effects. There are a lot of Indigenous people that are that cling still to their Catholic faith. I'm not sure in that position I could, but it is something that you have to respect and honor as you tailor and help work with communities to help them with their mental health supports. In the last year, particularly since Kamloops and the discoveries of unmarked graves, as well as the ones that have occurred since then across the country, there's a lot of searches that are going on, and they are done foremost by communities that we fund, the Government of Canada funds, not only in radar searches, which people, it sounds very fancy. It is cutting edge technology, but that isn't what costs a lot. What costs a lot of money financially is, and I say financially because it is difficult on those that you interview, but talking to survivors and correlating the data that you get from radar searches or potential sites with the oral history that they have and knowing where potential sites are. That's really, really difficult. So as part of that, in my role and in the role that Patty Haidu plays at Indigenous Services Canada, we have financial envelopes that we can help with communities to organize events and work with community members that have to go through this process. And that's the initial process, and actually finding unmarked graves. That there have been a number of articles written about why they are in the condition they are in when it happens to deal with cemeteries, but also plots of land that people have been saying for years, and it seems like it's bearing out to be true. There are hits or markings that there could be potential bodies there. It is really difficult to listen to a community that has to take a difficult decision to go in and search places, and then the next step of perhaps exhuming bodies and bringing them home. So in all that, there needs to be sustained government support, whether it's the Government of Canada, but also provinces that have a role in this, in making sure that community members have proper mental supports going forward. And then in the long term, and that's something we've heard along with making sure there are there's proper education, proper schooling, proper infrastructure to have schools on reserve, to have the proper resources for addictions facilities, for clinics that we all know are underfunded across the province, across Canada, but can't be, those are long-term solutions that need investment. They need to be built, and then in the meantime, we have to support people that are still really highly traumatized. That we know through the pandemic as well that there's been a lot of matters in and around mental health, whether it's the opioid crisis or people just not feeling good. It's important to speak up about it. It's okay not to be okay, but it is something that short-term solutions won't solve.
And many people say, obviously, the Pope's visit to Canada, again, a step forward in terms of Indigenous reconciliation to many people. But looking kind of beyond the visit that the Pope took to Canada, just in general, with achieving Indigenous reconciliation, I mean, a lot of people say that your government has more to do as it relates to stuff like clean drinking water for Indigenous peoples. I mean, what can you as a government commit to doing to ensure things like clean drinking water can continue to be assured to Indigenous peoples across Canada?
Yeah, look, 100%. Every year there's got to be sustained investments into closing those gaps that are basic necessities for humans. Clean drinking water in communities, schools, housing. We know throughout the crisis that people living in crowded, the COVID pandemic, that people living in crowded housings were more susceptible to getting COVID. That is the reality of life in a number of Indigenous communities, including the far north. So our last two budgets in particular, but ever since we've gotten into power, have had significant investments in infrastructure, in making sure that we are investing in Indigenous communities in the way we haven't in the past. The numbers bear it out, but the challenge, I think, is sustaining that throughout the long term and knowing that the housing gap will not be closed overnight. The infrastructure gap will not be closed overnight, making sure we are measuring these things, schools, hospitals, roads. These are all things that we've invested in quite heavily. And the results are now starting to be felt, but there is a cycle to building that you would obviously want this yesterday, but it takes a couple of years to get something up. I've had at least a number of opportunities to go into communities to see some amazing things that are going on. People are really proud of it, but in terms of things that are sort of as close to basic rights as you can get, which like clean water, building a new facility is something that not only takes the investment in capital, but training people up to work on these state-of-the-art facilities, which take advanced chemistry, advanced math, in some remote communities with a few hundred people. That's an ongoing challenge, but it's a challenge I think we need this country to face. This is a process in rectifying decades and decades of underinvestment, but it's one that I'm a member of a government of a particular political party, but I think if we want to achieve what we call in reconciliation, it's going to take the committed financial investment and dedication of any government, regardless of their political stripe.
Okay, that is Crown-Indigenous Relations Minister, Minister Marc Miller. Minister, thanks so much for making the time and for joining me today.
Thanks, Wyatt. I really appreciate you covering this super important topic.
Thanks so much.